my name is Ian Wildemann, and I'll be doing my video presentation on gluten-free brewing. Gluten is a small group of proteins found in wheat, rye, and barley. Almost all foods in any given supermarket you go to have at least a small amount of gluten in it. Gluten-intolerant people must avoid all gluten, as even eating a small amount can make them very sick. Gluten-free products obviously do not contain glutinous ingredients, but that's not all. What I want to talk about now is cross-contamination. Cross-contamination happens when a gluten-free object has touched the same surface as gluten before it has been thoroughly washed. The gluten will then contaminate the gluten-free object, making it inedible for gluten-intolerant people. These surfaces can be anything from a table to a knife to your hands. For example, if you use a toaster for regular bread and then use the same toaster for gluten-free bread, the gluten-free bread will be contaminated. After just one touch, an entirely new batch is needed. Beer is made of 4 ingredients: hops, yeast, water, and barley. Luckily, hops, yeast, and water are all gluten-free, but barley is the main ingredient and base for beer, so this presents a problem for gluten-free brewers. There are many alternatives to using barley for beer. These include buckwheat, amaranth, corn, millet, quinoa, rice, and sorghum. Now, I want to emphasize one thing from a gluten-free person's perspective. It is important to pick a good substitute, not just use any substitute. Some work far better than others. Just because you can make something using a certain gluten-free ingredient doesn't mean you should. For example, have you ever had a corn donut before? It's not good. It should never be made. Rice is a far better wheat substitute than corn could ever be. Just because you can make something doesn't mean you should. Because of this, I only want to focus on 2 gluten-free barley substitutes, sorghum and rice. Sorghum is a cereal grain commonly used for feeding farm animals. It is the most common gluten-free base. In brewing, though, it has far less flavor and color than barley does. Rice is the most common wheat substitute for gluten-free cooking, but in brewing, it has even less flavor and color than sorghum. Japanese people have been brewing with rice for hundreds of years, making rice beer and sake. Malt also contains gluten, so this means you will have to malt your own grain or use an extract as your base. Gluten-free beer is known to have significantly less flavor, be very dry, not have the same mouthfeel, and be much clearer in color than regular beer. It is important to make up for these shortcomings by adding other ingredients. Because sorghum and rice have such little flavor, it can be good to mix the base with other gluten-free ingredients such as chestnuts. You can even add corn sugar, cane sugar, corn syrup, rice syrup, molasses, honey, or fruit juices to your sorghum or rice base. You can also malt your own sorghum, adding even more to the flavor. It can be a good idea to use a cereal mash to gelatinize the base prior to extracting its fermentable sugars too. And lastly, you can make up for the flavor by adding extra hops. The good news is that hops are 100% gluten-free. Gluten-free brewers should feel free to add extra hops and experiment with different combinations. However, it is very important not to overhop the beer. Because there's not a lot of flavor, the flavor of the hops will be very prominent and can even overtake the rest of the flavors, making a very hoppy beer. Yeast is also 100% gluten-free, but there's a twist. Many yeast manufacturers grow or store yeast in glutinous environments. This can lead to a lot of cross-contamination. Some yeast makers even add gluten to their yeast, making it more suited for brewing. It is very important to check all packaging on yeast products to make sure it was not processed by the same machines that process gluten. English, Irish, and American yeast work best with sorghum and rice, while Belgian yeast infamously works poorly with these bases. Now that I've talked about gluten-free ingredients, I want to talk about the differences in the brewing process. Most of the steps are the same. However, there are slight alterations that need to be made to malting, gelatinization, and mashing processes. You cannot buy malted sorghum, and you cannot malt rice, so the only solution is to malt your own sorghum. Malting is time and space consuming, but is important for the flavor of gluten-free beer in particular. It can be a good idea to roast some of your homemade malt much more than usual to drag out all the flavor you can. Rice and sorghum have far higher gelatinization temperatures than barley. Barley is about 150 degrees Fahrenheit, while rice and sorghum is about 180. Because the temperature is so high, this leaves even fewer enzymes in the gelatin to convert starch into sugar, further reducing the flavor of the beer. When it comes to mashing, it is best to use decoction mashing for rice and sorghum. Decoction mashing is done by removing part of the mash, boiling it, and then returning it to the mash. This is done 3 times. Decoction mashing is used to get the most flavor possible out of your base, and is very useful for gluten-free brewing. Since sorghum doesn't have a husk, it is important to add rice husk to the mash. This will help the mash lauter correctly. Now I want to talk about Clarity Firm. White Labs came out with an enzyme called Clarity Firm that they claim can completely break down gluten particles, making a once contaminated beer gluten-free. I want to emphasize that this is not true. Clarity Firm really just breaks down the gluten particles into smaller particles. These new particles are so small that they cannot be detected by the ELISA test, the one true test for gluten. This is not a solution to gluten-free brewing, as it does not get rid of the gluten, it just shrinks it. I cannot believe that White Labs can continue to advertise this product this way, as I think it's intentionally misleading. It can make some people very sick. In summary, the only ingredient that you need to change in your brewing recipe is barley. Sorghum and rice are the best substitutes, but they significantly lack in flavor. It is also important to look for yeast that has not been cross-contaminated. The brewing process is mostly the same as well. However, you must malt your own grains, gelatinize at higher temperatures, and use decoction mashing instead of a regular mash. To make up for the lack of flavor, you can add other ingredients such as chestnuts, corn sugar, cane sugar, corn syrup, rice syrup, molasses, honey, and fruit juices to the base, and adding extra hops while not making your beer too hoppy. Gluten-free beer tastes different from regular beer. This is a fact. It is nearly impossible to make a gluten-free beer that tastes like a regular beer. But it is possible to make gluten-free beer taste better. With the addition of different ingredients and alteration to the traditional brewing process, gluten-free beer can be made far better than it is today. Gluten-free brewing is a generally new area of brewing, and there is much more to be discovered and experimented with.